This is Korea News for April 15, 2022. The social distancing policy that started due to the corona crisis will be lifted from next week. It has been 2 years and 1 month since the massive quarantine guidelines were introduced in March 2020. On the 15th, Prime Minister Kim Buletin Jae-im held a meeting on central disaster and safety measures at the government complex in Seoul and announced, from the 18th, the limit on the business hours of multi-use facilities, which is currently until 12 p.m., and the limit on the number of private gatherings that are allowed up to 10 people will be lifted from the 18th. Prime Minister Kim said, the limit on the number of events, assemblies, and religious facilities that can accommodate up to 70% of the capacity will also be removed at the same time, said Prime Minister Kim. We will also lift all food bans in the city, he said. However, the mandatory system to wear a mask indoors and outdoors will remain in effect. Prime Minister Kim said, it is inevitable to maintain indoor masks for a considerable period of time. In addition, from the 25th, the government decided to adjust the corona infectious disease grade from grade 1 to grade 2. If the grade is adjusted, there will be many changes, such as the need for home treatment as the quarantine duty changes to a recommendation. In order to minimize such confusion, the government is planning to proceed in stages with a period of 4 weeks. After the keynote, the new government will evaluate the level of implementation and decide whether to make a full transition. Prime Minister Kim said, we will prepare thoroughly under the assumption that danger may come again while promoting daily recovery. I will prepare myself to do it, he said. Efforts to prevent infection are still important, he said. During the week-long preparation period, relevant ministries, related organizations, and related industries worked closely together to come up with a multifaceted plan to protect the public from infection. While the Chosun Ilbo published an advertisement for a book by Man Manji, who distorted and denigrated Gwangju Oil Pal, a media civic group requested the Korea Newspaper Ethics Committee to review the advertisement. In a statement on the 14th, the Citizens Union Network for the National Democratic Press criticized, the advertisement published on this day was published in the name of an advertisement in the influential media outlets with obvious false facts and one-sided claims, revealing irresponsible and shameful journalism. On the 12th, the Chosun Ilbo published an advertisement containing remarks that distorted and denigrated the Gwangju Oil Pal, along with 4 books by Man Manji, claiming that the North Korean military infiltrated the Gwangju Oil Pal at the bottom of the opinion section on page 30. In an advertisement, Manji claimed, we concluded that the Gwangju Oil Pal was a war crime committed by North Korea. We found 42 pieces of evidence to support this. In addition, about the fact that he was convicted of false allegations through advertisements, Mr. G. Manwon said, they are trying to rule permanently using the Gwangju Oil Pal as a cause. It has been harshly suppressed against opposing views. As the discussion on special military service for HYBE's idol group BTS's military service took off in the political arena, voices of opposition such as it goes against equity and what is the standard for the promotion of national prestige are growing among men in their 20s and 30s. The issue of BTS military service was rekindled on the 2nd, when Ahn Cheol-soo, chairman of the Transition Committee for the Presidency, visited BTS agency HYBE, and HYBE made an official position, I hope that the discussion about the artists' military service will be settled in this National Assembly. The National Assembly has begun to speed up discussions on the so-called BTS Military Service Exception Act, which includes the Popular Culture and Arts India as an exception for military service. Song Il-jong, chairman of the People's Strength Policy Committee, who serves as a secretary of the National Assembly's National Defense Committee, said that both the government and the ruling and opposition parties are positive about whether BTS will be exempted from military service. Rep. Song took the position that the alternative service law for cultural and artistic artists should be approached from the viewpoint of fairness and national interest. Rep. Song said, at the time, when this law was enacted, it was not at all imagined that our young people would win the pop market. It seems to be a lack of, he said. However, among men in their 20s and 30s, sharp criticism continues over BTS military service exception. In particular, there were many netizens who opposed the remarks of National Power National Assembly member Song Il-jong that BTS had raised the national status. One netizen said, the significance of the current military exemption as a cultural artist lies in improving national prestige. In the current Act on Alternative Service for Cultural Artists, fine artists and athletes who have contributed to promoting national prestige and cultivating culture are recognized as special subjects. Another netizen commented, it is of course great that BTS won the Billboard chart first place and AMA Best Song Award, and it is true that they improved their national prestige. I should have given it to you, he said. It is also pointed out that the standard for promoting national prestige is ambiguous. Many netizens said, I don't know how to come up with a quantitative standard, and said, it seems like an ambiguous situation will arise where some people go and others don't. In addition, if pop music singers are exempted from military service, then esports players like Faker should also be exempted from military service. Popular music singers will follow suit and be exempted from military service. In the online community dominated by men in their 20s and 30s, there is also a movement to send a protest text to lawmaker Song Il-jong, who is the most active in discussing BTS military service exceptions. A netizen who said he was a member of the People's Strength Youth Party said to Rep. Song Il-jong, the feeling of deprivation of young people who have served in the military through BTS's military exemption is indescribable, he said. Another netizen also sent a text message to Rep. Song Il-jong, saying, do you know how much the men's conscription rate is now and say that? In order to protest BTS military service exception, the community is sharing the phone number of Rep. Song Il-jong and authenticating text messages. Rep. Song Il-jong also responded to the protest letter saying, "See you, please come." Earlier on the 11th, Rep. Song Il-jong expressed his will to deal with the bill, saying, "I am currently pursuing it with the intention of finalizing it in April in relation to the BTS Special Military Service Act, which is pending at the National Assembly on the 11th. With the debate centered around men in their 20s and 30s over the BTS military service exception, attention is focused on whether the discussion on BTS military service exception can be put to an end within this month." On the 14th, on a Chinese social network service, rumors circulated that people from constituencies once some restrictions were lifted were leaving Shanghai quickly. However, it was concluded that virtually all transportation had been stopped and that it was fake news. However, in a situation where it was impossible to get to the airport itself, an executive of an IT company representing China broke the quarantine rules and left Shanghai, causing controversy. On the 14th, local media in China reported that Alibaba's chief researcher and vice president of technology, Zhao Yangqing, had escaped from Shanghai. It all started when he posted on his Facebook account, "I came back to the United States from Shanghai." After arriving in Shanghai from the US and being thoroughly quarantined for 18 days, he said, "The last 72 hours in Shanghai were the most unforgettable experience of my life." He described the lockdown situation in Shanghai in a rather negative way on Facebook, saying food was scarce and confusing as the city was locked down. Then he described that he got a pass through his connections and got out of the quiet Shanghai by car at 4 in the morning. He explained that after helping a woman who had been isolated without food for 2 days at the airport, she was able to sleep safely on a plane that crossed the Pacific Ocean to the United States. 45 minutes after I left Shanghai Pudong Airport, the American consulate in Shanghai ordered all employees and their families to evacuate to the United States, he said. This post on Facebook by Yangqing Zhao was caught up in controversy over preferential treatment and received strong criticism from netizens in China. He explained, "After arriving in Shanghai, I was quarantined for 2 weeks and then returned to the United States because I was not feeling well. During the lockdown in Shanghai, even going to the airport through a personal network became controversial, saying, I mean that my friend called a taxi for me and went to the airport instead of calling a taxi," he said. "I explained it, but netizens did not even believe this." Just before posting the explanation in Chinese, he deleted the problematic English post from Facebook. However, the Chinese media are already mulling over his words one by one while translating the original content of his Facebook post into Chinese. In addition, he pointed out that among the expressions he used, strict quarantine was used to express negative meanings about China's quarantine policy in overseas media. The quarantine period in Shanghai also did not comply with quarantine rules. According to current quarantine regulations in Shanghai, China, intensive quarantine at the facility for 14 days after arriving in Shanghai and self-quarantine for 7 days after that are mandatory. In other words, in order to freely walk in public places after entering Shanghai, you must isolate for at least 21 days, but 3 days are not enough because he said that he returned to the United States in 18 days. Chinese media criticizes the fact that he, a high-ranking official at Alibaba, China's leading IT company, posted such a post on overseas social network services as inappropriate behavior that tarnishes China's quarantine policy and disrupts the quarantine order in Shanghai. Ordinary citizens suffering from the seemingly endless lockdown policy were dismayed, asking, does high-ranking officials receive preferential treatment under such circumstances? After graduating from Tsinghua University, one of the most prestigious universities in China, Zhao Yangqing joined Alibaba Big Data Platform R&D team in March 2019 and is known as the youngest vice president of technology at Alibaba. Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs expressed its displeasure at the Taiwan office of the State Council of China. In Taiwan, comments on China are usually made through the Continental Committee, a ministry in charge of China, but this time, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is paying attention to commenting directly on China. According to the Taiwan Associated Press, on the night of the 14th, Taiwanese Foreign Ministry spokesman Ma Xiaoguang, spokesman for the Taiwan Affairs Office of the State Council of China, at a press conference on the 13th, said that the comments about Taiwan's relations with Taiwan's foreign minister were rude and vulgar and not up to the standards of the civilized world. He said. Taiwanese Foreign Minister Wu Zhaoxi recently appeared on an internet broadcast and said, an important principle of Taiwan-US relations is consideration for a good friend of the United States. When the United States is busy, Taiwan shouldn't be bothered by trouble, and it shouldn't bring too many surprises, he said. For this reason, China called Taiwan a slave, not even a friend of the United States, but a concubine. At a press conference on the 13th, spokesperson Ma Xiaoguang said, Wu Zhaoxi confessed to himself. The face of the pitiful beggar for help, waving his tail like a dog to ultimately depend on as the Democratic Progressive Party authorities crawled in front of diplomatic forces, was vividly revealed. He's not even a concubine, he said. On the morning of the 14th, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Taiwan sat down at the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee of the Legislative Council of Taiwan and briefly answered, I do not think the remarks of the Taiwan Public Office are worth refuting. The Taiwanese Foreign Ministry was not offended by the brief remarks of the Taiwanese Foreign Minister, and the Taiwanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a comment the same night. Taiwan has been recognized by the international community as a successful example of democracy, a reliable partner, and a force of goodwill in the world in recent years, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said. On the other hand, the Chinese Communist Party government has been engaged in indiscriminate wartime diplomacy, expansion of authoritarianism, cognitive warfare, and cyber attacks, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said. Announced a joint statement on cooperation. China has been recognized internationally as a culprit that causes regional tension and undermines world peace and development, the ministry said in a statement. TSMC of Taiwan, the number one semiconductor foundry industry, recorded the best performance in the first quarter of this year. Sales exceeded KRW 20 trillion on a quarterly basis for the first time in history, and operating profit also approached KRW 10 trillion. Samsung Electronics recorded 77 trillion won in sales in the first quarter, and the foundry division is expected to record around 7 trillion won in sales. This means that TSMC earned 3 times more than Samsung Electronics foundry division. The semiconductor industry predicted that TSMC's performance would improve further into the second half of the year as the shortage of semiconductors continued. TSMC announced on the 15th that in the first quarter of this year, it recorded sales of NT dollar 491.1 billion, about 20.798 billion won, and operating profit of NT dollar 223.8 billion, about 9.478 trillion won. Compared to the same period last year, sales and operating profit increased by 35.5% and 48.7%. TSMC semiconductor production in the first quarter of this year was estimated at 3778,000 units based on 12-inch wafers. This is an increase of 12.5% compared to a year ago. TSMC said, the production capacity jumped by more than 10% in a year due to the surge in semiconductor orders. For the first time, 50% of total sales came from 7 nano or less microprocessing. As the Wall Street Journal said, we have completed a virtuous cycle structure in which microprocess development leads to sales. The industry expected that the proportion of TSMC's microprocess sales will increase in the future. High-performance computing, HPC, accounted for the largest share of sales at 41%. It surpassed smartphones, 40%, for the first time. This can be interpreted as meaning that microprocessing is growing as a future driving force for TSMC as it is applied to high-performance computing. At the same time, it can be analyzed to mean that Apple and AMD, which have a high proportion of high-performance computing, have established themselves as the largest customers of TSMC. TSMC predicted that the semiconductor shortage would be prolonged. This is because the supply is still insufficient compared to the demand. In the earnings announcement, TSMC CEO Wei Zhize said, as global supply chains are disrupted due to geopolitical risks, finished product makers are expanding their stockpiles of semiconductor chips and other components. The semiconductor chip shortage may be longer than expected. Accordingly, TSMC has drawn the line that there is no market-fearing price cut for foundries. Some have predicted that foundry companies, including TSMC, will be able to lower their foundry prices from the second half of this year as production increases while demand for semiconductor chips decreases. However, the CEO of TSMC himself responded that there was no price cut. Meanwhile, the industry forecasts that TSMC sales in the second quarter of this year will be $17.3 billion, about 21.236 trillion won. This is a 40% increase compared to the same period last year and is the highest ever. In the report, Murray Asset Securities said, even in uncertain circumstances, TSMC is rapidly increasing its sales by increasing the proportion of high-value-added processes. Authorities are investigating a case in which she became pregnant after having sex with her fellow inmates at a women's prison in the United States. NewJersey.com reported on the 14th, local time, that 2 inmates at Edna Myhan Prison, the only female-only correctional facility in New Jersey, were found to be pregnant. Pregnant inmates told the New Jersey Department of Justice that they had consensual sexual intercourse with a transgender inmate. New Jersey last year enacted a law that gave inmates the right to choose a correctional facility based on their gender, rather than the biological sex they were determined at birth. As a result, sexual minorities such as transgender people can spend their lives in prison with inmates of the desired sex regardless of their biological sex. Currently, 27 transgender people are incarcerated at Edna Myhan Prison, where more than 800 inmates are held. However, the law does not state that gender reassignment surgery is mandatory, so if an inmate claims that she is a transgender woman, she will be living with a woman. New Jersey's position is that it enacted such a law to protect the rights and interests of sexual minorities. But last year, 2 female inmates at Edna Myhan Prison filed a lawsuit demanding a transfer from a transgender person who had not undergone surgery. They allege that some male inmates who were imprisoned in women's prisons after reporting their sexual identity as transgender in the complaint were sexually harassed and attempted to have sexual contact. Thank you for watching today. Please like and subscribe.